Good evening and welcome to the second session, Monitoring Israel Past, Present, and Future in conjunction with NGO Monitor. It's a series that's designed to feature Israel's leading thinkers and contributors, and tonight will certainly be no exception. If anybody would like any more information about this, please contact the new website, which is programming.tbdj.org, where you can get more information about this series and other programming, especially applicable during these days of lockdown and isolation. Before I have the pleasure of introducing tonight's speaker, I'd first like to introduce Michael Surt, who is a fellow TBDJ member, and he happens to be very involved with the NGO Monitor Montreal Committee. And he's going to provide us with a brief overview of this organization. Michael?
Thank you, David, for the introduction. For those of you who know me, I'm sure many of you recognize my face from Shul. I'm Michael Zert. I'm a member at our Shul. And I'm also involved with the Montreal Committee of NGO Monitor. We've been doing this for a number of years now, bringing people together here who are interested in supporting the work of NGO Monitor. So I want to say a few words about NGO Monitor. It was founded by professional Gerald Steinberg. It's based in Jerusalem. And essentially what they do is they use both facts through research and some, I don't know if the right word is leverage, but some political leverage, let's say, to sort of expose Western governments who are funding, probably unbeknownst to them, through their foreign aid, the activities of essentially terrorists, Israel bashers, and BDS. And the way they're doing this, sort of not always recognizing what they're doing, is there's a lot of non-governmental organizations across the world who have, and especially in the Middle East, who have very appealing names associated with peace and democracy building and charity and feeding people. And oftentimes, these non-governmental organizations are in fact transferring money to BDS campaigns, to terrorists, etc. And so they're a little bit of a front for some not so great activities. And over the last number of years, NGO Monitor has cut about 65 million US of funding by going to European governments, North American governments, including the Canadian government, and saying, I understand that you're funding, say in the case of Canada, they were funding UNICEF for some activities in the West Bank, and by association and looking at who's involved in their board and everything else, they pointed out that the money was not being used in the way that they thought. It was being used to promote anti-Israel campaigns, etc., which is not certainly the goal of foreign aid coming out of Canada. And it's the same with a lot of other countries in Europe, North America, etc. Through their research, they have even, their research was quoted, by the Secretary of State of the US in terms of their decision to stop funding any organizations that are associated with BDS. So that was a big, huge win for NGO Monitor. So, there'll be more about NGO Monitor coming up. There are a few more sessions coming up in 2021, I should say, including a very interesting one in January. Watch your emails. There'll be more information about that one. We're so happy, and I'm so happy to be involved in the Shul and to see our Shul partnering with NGO Monitor. So I think you're in for a real treat tonight with Einat Wilf, and I hand it back to you, David.
Thank you, Michael. I now have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker tonight, Dr. Einat Wilf. Dr. Wilf, I've gotten to know her mainly by reading her CV, her book, and about her on the internet, and she has some very impressive accomplishments. She's a sought-after writer, thinker, speaker on many topics, especially to do with Zionism and Israel. She was a member of the Knesset, the 18th Knesset from 2010-2013, when she represented the Labor Party. And at that time, she was the chair of the Education, Sports, and Cultural Committee and a member of the very influential Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. She was born and raised in Israel. She previously served as an intelligence officer in Tzahal, in the Israel Defense Forces, and later was a foreign policy advisor to Vice Prime Minister Shimon Peres at that time, and subsequently a strategic consultant with McKinsey and Company. She has impressive educational credentials. She has a BA from Harvard, an MBA from INSEAD in France, and a PhD in political science from Cambridge. She's authored no less than 6 books, many articles, and she's had many media appearances and continues to be sought after as a speaker. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Wilf. She's going to be speaking tonight about the book that she recently co-authored, The War of Return, How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace. Dr. Wilf.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's a true honor. And I want to share with you why I have spent the better part of the last decade writing, thinking, speaking, researching on the topic of the Palestinian refugees and what is known as the right of return. Normally, when people think about the peace process, the obstacles to peace, especially between Israelis and Palestinians, you will hear about the occupation, about settlements, about Israeli intransigence. You will hear very little about the issues of refugees and return. Even if you go a little deeper into the topic, you are likely to come out with the impression that the issue of the Palestinian refugees, the right of return, is a minor issue compared to the major stumbling blocks of territory, borders, security, settlements, Jerusalem. And I want to make the case that this is the issue, and that there is no understanding why we don't have peace without understanding this issue. And for that, I want to go back a bit to my experiences, why I even came to the realization that this is the issue, and why, therefore, I decided to devote so much time to it. I grew up in Israel, in Jerusalem, in Beit HaKerem. I was very much socially and politically associated with the Israeli Labor Party, might we say now, rest in peace. But at the time, a dominant force in Israeli politics. And as a young adult in the 80s and the 90s, I very much adopted the politics of the Labor Party, which especially in the late 80s and early 90s became associated with the promotion of peace. The Labor Party during that time actually successfully reinvented itself away from socialism into peace. And the idea of the promotion of peace was that there's a straight and simple path to peace. It's based on an elegant and simple formula, which was known then as land for peace. The idea was that Israel can achieve peace, the peace that eluded it when it was born, and none of its Arab neighbors and not neighbors were willing to make peace with it. And the idea that Israel could finally have that elusive peace by handing over territory, which territory? The territory that Israel captured as a result of the Six-Day War in 1967. We're talking about the Golan Heights in the north, the Sinai Peninsula in the south, and the Gaza Strip and the West Bank in the center. The idea was that if Israel handed over these territories to its neighbors, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, it will have peace. And for a while, this formula seemed to be working. Land for peace was the basis for the peace agreement with Egypt in 1979. And just so we have proportions, the Sinai Peninsula is more than twice the size of Israel. So Israel handed over the entire Sinai Peninsula without settlements, with its oil fields, to the Egyptians in exchange for peace or for a peace agreement. I think we can now have a very interesting discussion as to whether what we have with Egypt should properly be called peace. When Jordan gave up its claim to the West Bank, we made peace with Jordan with some territorial adjustments. But the idea also was land was no longer an issue. We're now making peace. We negotiated with the Syrians during the 90s over the future of the Golan Heights based on the same formula. And of course, the highlight of the 90s was the labor-led efforts, initially by Rabin and later by Barak, to reach a peace agreement with the Palestinians based on the Land for Peace formula. And indeed, the most dominant of these efforts was by Ehud Barak in Camp David in 2000, where he basically offered to give the Palestinians the West Bank and Gaza, no settlements. So to those who say that the obstacle to peace is the settlements, there were going to be no settlements. They were either going to be dismantled or exchanged for equivalent land. Jerusalem, to those who say Jerusalem is the problem, Palestinians were going to get East Jerusalem, all the Arab neighborhoods, including parts of the old city, so including holy sites. There was going to be an end to the occupation, obviously, with the establishment of an independent Palestinian state that controls its borders. People forget how far-reaching the proposal was. The proposal was codified later in what became known as the Clinton parameters. All the Palestinians had to do was say yes, just sign on the dotted line. They would have had an independent Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, free of settlements, no occupation, capital in East Jerusalem. Everything that we were told in the Israeli peace camp, in the Israeli left, that the Palestinians wanted, that was the path to peace. What did the Palestinians do? Of course, they walk away. Arafat walks away in 2000. Abu Mazen walks away from an even more far-reaching proposal by Ehud Olmert in 2008. Both cases, it's followed by very intense violence, especially in 2001, 2, 3, known as the Second Intifada, the suicide bombings. And the thing is that not only does Arafat walk away, not only is it followed by bloody massacres in our streets, there's no criticism, there's no Palestinian criticism of Arafat for walking away. There's Western criticism, but there's no Palestinian criticism, which means that in walking away and initiating violence, Arafat was doing what his people wanted. There's this myth of the evil Palestinian leadership and the peace-seeking Palestinian people. But there was no criticism, which means he was carrying out what the Palestinian people wanted. Otherwise, you would have expected to have at least one op-ed, one person going on TV and saying, hey, go back there and get us our state. Are you insane? We could have had a state, an end to the occupation, no settlements. What are you doing walking away? But there's no such criticism, which means that he's doing what the Palestinians want. And this really becomes the question of the Israeli peace camp. It becomes my question. It becomes my co-writer's question, who was a senior editor at Haaretz, Adi Schwartz. What do the Palestinians want? They clearly don't want a state in the West Bank and Gaza. They could have had it several times and they walked away. They clearly don't want an end to the occupation in the West Bank and Gaza. They could have had that. They clearly don't want a capital in East Jerusalem. They could have had that. They clearly don't want an end to the settlements. They could have had that. So what do they want? And we realized that the answer was hiding in plain sight. It was staring us in the face. We just didn't see it, or when we did see it, we didn't want to see it. What the Palestinians wanted was what they've said they've always wanted. It's what they still say they want in every pro-Palestinian demonstration: from the river to the sea. They want an Arab Palestine with no Israel as a Jewish state in any borders. And that desire, that wish, is most manifested at this point in what the Palestinians call the right of return and the idea of the perpetual refugee situation of millions of Palestinians. And just to be clear on why the from the river to the sea is connected to this idea of the perpetual refugees and the right of return. For many decades, Palestinians pursued this idea of no Israel by thinking that wars, such as the War of 1967, will achieve that, will undo Israel, will undo the War of 1948. That didn't go too well. Terrorism, violence were the means, international and economic boycotts. But as Palestinians, under pressure as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union, turned to the West, they began to speak of their support for two states, which some of them still do. And a lot of people, including me, mistakenly viewed it as a true Palestinian historical rupture with their desire for a single Arab state that overtakes Israel. But what they did say is that they support two states, but in parallel and more quietly, they never gave up on their demand that millions of Palestinians, the descendants of the several hundreds of thousands who fled the War of 1948 and some were expelled, that there are millions of descendants who live today in the West Bank and Gaza and Jordan and Syria and Lebanon and other places, have in their mind a right, which, as we show in the book, is not a right, but they believe they have a legally sanctioned right that is more powerful than Israeli sovereignty to settle inside the state of Israel. Now, the numbers are such, the numbers of these so-called refugees are in the high millions. The numbers are such that the exercise of this so-called right of return would mean the transformation of Israel into an Arab majority country with a Jewish minority. So when Palestinians say that they support two states, as they did throughout the 90s and even since, but when you force the issue and you ask them, what about the right of return? Very few people know to ask the question. They say, well, that's holy, that's a right, that's sacred, that belongs to every Palestinian in perpetuity. When they say that and you put two and two together, it means that the only peace that was ever envisioned by Palestinians through the negotiating decades of the 90s and to the present was always an Arab Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, and another Arab Palestinian state to replace Israel. To date, there has never been any Palestinian leader, not even an op-ed writer for that matter, whose vision of peace was truly one of a Palestinian Arab state next to a Jewish sovereign state. In their mind, that is still a non-starter. The Jews in their minds are foreigners, colonizers, crusaders. We're the French in Algeria. And as with all colonizers and foreigners and crusaders, the solution for us is to leave. It's not to have our own sovereign state anywhere in any borders. So our book basically details how this whole idea of the perpetual Palestinian refugee developed, how a special agency called UNRWA, that is still temporary after 70 years, exists to this day, funded by Western countries, keeping Palestinians in this perennial limbo by which the War of 1948 is still alive, still creates new refugees from that old war, and that all these refugees possess a non-existent so-called right of return into the sovereign state of Israel, by which the War of 1948 will finally be over with an Arab-Palestinian victory as it should have been in their minds. So Adi and I, for several years now, have taken to highlight that this is the issue, that this is the obstacle, and this is the easiest and simplest explanation of Palestinian behavior. Anytime the Palestinians were presented with a choice, they can have their own state, a fully sovereign state, in part of the land, but the Jews will have a sovereign state in the other part. Given their narrative of the Jews as foreigners, their response has always been to say no. And in their mind, it's not a delusion. It's a rational response of a people who belong to the dominant majority in the region. Adi and I meet many European and Western diplomats who often, the reason that they dismiss the whole right of return is they say, the Palestinians know that Israel is powerful. They can't force Israel to take them. They know it's a delusion. And I always tell them, look, the Palestinians, if anything, they're the rational side in this conflict. They open a map. They see 7 million Jews. In the past, we were 5, 4, 3, 2, struggling to survive in the midst of nearly 500 million Arabs, over 1 billion Muslims. From their perspective, they rationally conclude that they only need to wait us out 1, 2, 3, 5 more generations, and we'll be gone, like the French, like the Crusaders, like the British. So the only path to peace is one in which the Palestinians finally abandon this vision. And this is a much, much, much higher bar than exchanging land or borders or even removing settlements, because this goes to the core of the Palestinian identity of themselves as people who have been unjustly wronged by invading Zionists, who are at the forefront of the Arab and Islamic struggle against the invading foreigners. They need to transform and rewrite their whole understanding of what it means to be a Palestinian. And that's a painful process that nations have gone through. It's not an impossible process, but it's a painful process. And it will only happen the day Palestinians understand that they have no choice, that they no longer have the backing of the Arab world. And one of the reasons that I'm more optimistic these days is that we're beginning to peel away Arab support from the Palestinians, which means that they are coming under greater and greater pressure to understand that they no longer have the blank check of support that they used to have from the Arab world. And what we're trying to do with our book and our efforts is to prevent the Western world from making up for what the Arab world is now beginning to take away from the Palestinians. Because the greatest tragedy in our minds, call it an irony or tragedy, is that at the moment that the Arab world is finally beginning to tell the Palestinians, you know what, it's over. We no longer need you as the vanguard of the fighting against the foreign invaders, because we kind of like them and we're cool with them and it's fine. To have at that moment the West rush to fill that void and say, no, please, you're still refugees. You have a right of return. Keep fighting. This is justice, means that the conflict will be basically extended more than is necessary. So this is why I've decided to devote the better part of a decade to exposing, researching, speaking on the issue of the Palestinian refugees, and really showing why this is the issue and why any serious peacemaker, and I have to share with you, I still consider myself very much a peacemaker, an Israeli leftist, a member of the peace camp, but one who now understands that the path to peace is not the simple formula we once had. It's still necessary. The Palestinians will need to have land where they govern themselves, but that is not enough. They need to go through the painful process of rethinking their very identity towards building a nation state of their own next to Israel rather than instead of Israel.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilf. Having read the book, I have to say, although you conveyed the idea, it's really, I want to just invite other people to read the book, because I really developed a much deeper understanding of how this whole issue developed, and the UN, the UNRWA, and the politicization that went by. And it's interesting, you never even got into radical Islam. It didn't even enter into it. You didn't even need to. And it was so clear why this is such a huge problem. Of course, knowing that it's such a huge problem, you wonder what is the solution. So let's just start off. There's a couple of questions that we received already, and so I'd like to introduce those, and then hopefully that'll generate some further discussion. And you touched on this a little bit, and I'm sure everybody's thinking about this. And really, I have to say again, reading your book now with this recent wonderful moves forward with the Abraham Accords, and then starting to see that hopefully what you just said before is really right, that the world is starting to see it, the Arab world is starting to see it, and that'll pressure the Palestinians into eventually getting that message. So the first question is, will normalization deals between Israel and new regional countries have any impact on the long-standing narratives you write about, either publicly or behind the scenes?
So the Arab countries are really essential to the whole story. If this had truly been an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it would have been over in April 1948. In April 1948, the war between Jews and Arabs in British Mandate Palestine is effectively over. Pretty much everyone, it's clear who's where, and the war would have been over at this point. It is the invasion of 5 Arab armies once the British leave in May 1948 that turns it into the Israeli-Arab conflict. And that's the way it remains for decades, with the Arab world using all its might, the oil, the Cold War, in order to force the West, for example, to keep UNRWA operational, to isolate Israel as much as possible, and of course to engage in multiple military conflicts and house bases for terrorism. The ability of Palestinians to reject Israel for decades was only because they had Arab and Soviet support. That's it. So they no longer have Soviet support. They began to have some Western support, but they still had the support of the Arab world. The Arab world for decades gave them a blank check for rejectionist positions. Now what we're seeing is that change. When Egypt and Jordan made peace with Israel, they nudged the Palestinians, but not enough. They never really confronted the Palestinians with a clear saying that says, 1948 is a closed case. Move on, we're done, and Israel is here to stay. That was not really the message. This is why we've had a cold peace with Egypt and Jordan. It's more basically a ceasefire agreement or a non-aggression pact than true peace. Now with the Abraham Accords, we're seeing something different. It's normalization, it's true peace. And we're seeing Arab leaders, Arab thought leaders, political leaders, cultural leaders, telling the Palestinians in very harsh terms, terms that the West would be afraid to use, basically telling them it's over, we're done, we've supported you long enough in your rejectionist positions, but enough. Israel is here today, is here to stay. Israel as the Jewish state is here to stay. That's a big difference. So we respect the right of the Jewish people to their own nation state in the region. They're not foreigners, they're not crusaders, they're not colonialists, they belong here. I mean, you're really hearing them say these things. The Jews have a history in Jerusalem, the Jews have a history in the land. They're reversing all these narratives, they're changing even the books. They're coming out with TV programs that are favorable to Jews, which shows that really the Arab attitude towards Zionism was always related to the Arab attitude towards Jews, and especially Jews as sovereign and equal. So what's important for us is that the Western world follow the lead of the Arab world in telling the Palestinians that it's over, rather than extending the conflict by giving the Palestinians false hope that they have support for their from the river to the sea ambitions.
Thank you. Thank you. It's, you know, just think of it as a daunting process to think that you could change the mindset of a people. You gave such vivid examples in your book, and we read about it elsewhere, about what children are taught in Palestinian schools, the things that we would never think of even telling our children, and this is what's told to them and taught to them to try to get them. So I say we have a lot of work to undo all the damage that's already been done, but hopefully it'll start. You're obviously very involved in Israeli politics. You were Chaveret Knesset. You live there. You're part of this whole landscape. For us, even those of us who are passionate about Israel and follow it closely, Israeli politics are always always a bit of a huge guessing game, and you wonder what's coming up next. We get the feeling from what we're reading that elections are not going to be that far away, even though we've already had enough elections to last us a long time. And we see that things are happening. So one question that arrived that I'd like to ask you is, and I'll just read the question directly, with Israel drawing closer to a fourth set of elections and more superstar parties, that's in quotations, and fragmentation on deck, how does Israel get out of this political logjam?
So I have a feeling that somewhere between 20 to 50 years from now, we will finally understand this moment, because it's clearly not just about Israel. You're seeing multiple countries plunged into their own particular form of constitutional crises, of electoral crises, of political crises. And something tells me that this is bigger than just Israel, that 20 years from now, we will realize that it had to do with the effect of social media, the rising partisanship, the inability to reach decisions through deliberation in parliaments. So I think Israel is now going through its own version of this constitutional crisis. And a part of me, I always wonder whether this is a classic glass half full, half empty situation. Because one way to look at it is to say that the globe is going through seismic changes in what it means to be a democracy, who gets to decide, what is a nation state. And rather than being plunged into civil war, we have multiple elections, and I should see it as a glass half full of Israel working out this crisis moment in history through multiple elections, and that is better than the alternative, which would be a civil war. Or is it really a glass half empty situation where this is just, you know, things are heading in a very bad direction? So I have to say it's too early to tell, in the sense that we're in the midst of it. We're in the midst of this crisis, which I think is really merely the political and electoral manifestation of deeper currents that are global, about who we are as a people, who we are as a state, who gets to decide, battle between old elites and new elites, identity politics. So I think really we just are having our own particular version of something that is sweeping many societies.
All right, thank you for that. At this point, it would be beautiful to open things up to members of the audience. We can't do that, though, unfortunately, in this particular forum. I don't have any other questions to ask at this point, but I would just like to put in a little plug. Nobody asked me to do this, but I have to say this book was really interesting. It's written by Dr. Wilf and her co-author, Adi Schwartz. There's a lot of very good factual information, regardless of what your opinion might be. It's a great lesson. It's written in a very easy to read way. There's a lot of wonderful anecdotes. I loved some of them, and I mean, some of them, to be honest, were very shocking. There was one on page 117. I reminded myself of that page because to me, that was a real turning point in terms of what I was able to understand. When a new former American economics professor, John Davis, was appointed the Commissioner General of the UNRWA, that was in early January 1959. And I think until that point, if I'm not mistaken, it wasn't really a politicized organization. And I don't know what John Davis, what made up his background, but he came out with this statement that you quoted that to me was very, very chilling, which said that the resistance and opposition of Arab peoples to Israel as a state would continue virtually unabated, regardless what happened. In other words, as you sort of described, as exactly what we see, that no matter what gestures Israel has tried to do, we haven't been able to change their mindset. But at least now there is hope. I think there is hope now when we see other states are starting to come around and say, well, there's more to Israel than just this particular issue. In Israel, the truth is, if only the world could see the beauty of Israel and what Israel already does for so many people in the world. And I know that we're just going to continue to do more and to really be what we're supposed to be, which is really an Or LaGoyim, and really show the world a wonderful example. At any rate, I really want to thank you on behalf of everyone, Dr. Wilf, for joining us, taking time out of your extremely busy schedule, and sharing with us some of the insights. And again, people get more insights by reading the book. There will be continuation of this series. The next one will be with Professor Eliakim Rubinstein, the former Attorney General and Supreme Court Justice in Israel, which was scheduled to be January 22nd, but that date might be subject to change. I'd really like to say Erev Tov. Thank you so much, Dr. Wilf, for joining us. And we hope to join you soon in Yerushalayim, or at least Tel Aviv. So thank you, everybody, for joining us, and good night.
Good night.